Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Today, we are going to be talking about the DSM-5 criteria for autism. Again, you can read this for yourself. There's also plenty of resources out there if you don't have access to the DSM-5 book itself. You can get your information from the CDC. They have everything listed out, but you can also find the diagnostic criteria for autism written out and presented in more of an infographic form by Dr. Neff, who posted everything at neurodivergentinsights.com. That is also, while not a diagnosable medical tool, it is a way for you to do more of like a self-assessment, to go through some of the criteria and understand it a little bit better. We'll be referencing both today. I think the official DSM-5 and then some examples from our own lives or examples that Dr. Neff and other people have talked about.
We will be using the CDC autism diagnostic tools. The article is literally labeled Clinical Testing and Diagnosis for Autism Spectrum Disorder. If you would like to look it up yourself, we will include a link in the description below, along with the link to Dr. Neff. That way you can follow along with us. It's like a sing-along, except with autism. An autism along.
An autism along. Yeah, I think one of the main things that we've seen happen with social media is that people are getting a little bit more familiar with autism, or they're at least seeing videos or, memes or things come across their page that are about autism. And
a lot of people
can be
are
good
confused.
or bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because not everyone is educated about what the actual diagnostic criteria for autism is. And no, rubbing your feet before you sleep is not diagnostic criteria for autism. And if I see that video again,
oh my gosh,
there's
no way. The way you walk, okay, is not a sign of autism. I've seen those videos so many times.
Yes. Now, to be fair, I want to acknowledge that there are certain things that are not necessarily diagnostic criteria for autism, but common identifiers of autism in children, such as toe walking. Toe walking is not diagnostic criteria for autism. You will not find that in the DSM. Some people argue that it could be along with abnormal posture. That's a symptom we will go over, but it's not actually listed in the DSM. However, it is something that doctors will look for in identifying autism in children because it is so prevalent within autistic kids. Same with sitting. It's called W sitting, but it's basically where you sit with your butt on the ground and your feet pointed out in exact opposite directions. Again, that is an identifying trait.
A lot of these
autism.
things, like we just mentioned, are also just really symptoms of hypermobility, which many, it is this high percentage of autistic people are hypermobile. And so that's where you start to think all autistic people do this. And so it's not actually diagnostic criteria. It's just a common comorbidity or a common experience that we see. But again, things like if you like this sound or you rub your feet together like that. That's not a criteria for autism.
Those are not criteria for autism. They can be included in other things, but the ways that we talk about the autism criteria and autism signs is very important, which is why we wanted to go over the diagnostic tools for autism, the actual diagnostic criteria. One thing that is important to remember is that when diagnosing autism using the diagnostic criteria, in order to meet diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, according to the DSM-5, a person must have persistent deficits in each of the 3 areas of social communication and interaction, plus at least 2 of 4 types of restrictive repetitive behaviors. There is something that is being studied right now called the broader autism phenotype, which is people who don't necessarily meet all of the diagnostic criteria for autism, but meet a significant amount. However, because that's in theory stage and still in study stage, we are not going to be discussing that today.
So again, for the criteria, you have to meet most of this before you get an autism diagnosis. And I think that's really helpful to keep in mind, because a lot of the greater public just assumes that an autism and autistic diagnosis comes from people watching 2 videos. And that's not actually the case.
Just so you know, in case you go through this and you find out you don't meet enough criteria in order to be autistic, that doesn't mean you're completely out of our orbit. It's okay. You can still sit with us. We are not like Mean Girls. We don't think that just because you're not wearing pink on Wednesday means you can't sit with us. No, you can still sit with us. We are still happy to have you here in our community, and you are absolutely welcome to join us on these journeys.
All right. What are the criteria A for autism?
Criteria A for autism: persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts as manifested by the following: currently or by history. So what that means is that you have to have certain deficits in the ways that you interact socially with the community around you. Social interactions across multiple contexts means that you have to have these difficulties not just with strangers, because, social anxiety is a thing aside from autism, but these deficits persist in multiple areas of your life. So like, having communication difficulties with your parents, having communication difficulties with all 5 of your sisters who then bully you over it and cause you trauma for all of your life. Not based on a true story.
It also means that these are difficulties that you had in childhood. Mm-hmm. And maybe at this point as an adult, you have some strategies, some coping mechanisms that you use, and you've learned to mask and hide some of them. But you still, on your worst day, or if you didn't have those coping mechanisms, they would be disabling to you. They would be a big struggle for you.
Sometimes even with the coping mechanisms, I'm still
again, but just it's something to think about, because a lot of people are like, well, I don't struggle with it anymore because I do this, and this to hide it.
Which is also another reason why I think there's that common misconception that autism is just a childhood diagnosis and that you grow out of it. You don't grow out of it. A lot of the times you've just learned how to accommodate yourself. So those deficits are listed as deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, and also include failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. So what that means is that autistic people don't this autistic criteria means that you struggle and have historically struggled with, since childhood, a failure to have a balanced conversation with people. Like either you're not talking enough or you are dominating the conversation. You don't know when it is your turn to stop talking. Like for me in particular, my best friend told me that she had never seen, when we were kids, she told me that she had never seen somebody try and interrupt her dad while he was speaking, and she did not know how to handle that because I kept interrupting him. That was me not knowing it was not my turn to speak. It was not my turn to speak at all. But that's autism. That is a part of autism.
Yeah. I mean, and I have known for talking too much, for constantly info dumping and just charging into situations and completely taking over conversations. That, again, since I was a toddler and in preschool and beyond, that has always been an issue for me. Is like they would call me a little bulldozer, that I would just come in and just verbal vomit everywhere because I was so fixated on only one thing, and communications.
It literally happened to me just the other day at school because I heard people sitting at a table, like 2 tables away from me in the cafeteria, talking about autism. And I don't know these people. I just immediately jumped in on their conversation to educate them about autism. And like the looks on their faces were like terrified. And I'm like, I know I'm being completely rude, but I
can't stop.
Info dump. It has to happen.
My mom even said to other kids when I was growing up, they'd be like, you can just raise your hand and tell Lindsey it's your turn to talk.
Yeah.
Because I did not have the wherewithal. I thought I had friendships, and it turns out this is not a reciprocal relationship. This is a kid who didn't know how to stand up to me, and I was just taking over everything. And so that can be what it looks like as well. Part of this criteria, so number 2, is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body languages, or deficits in understanding the use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. And what the stereotype has been is blank-faced, robotic, autistic, and that this person is nonverbal, things like that. What we're starting to see now as examples of this is autistic people who make either no eye contact, or we hate it. It's painful for us. It's very uncomfortable. Or prolonged eye contact. We look like we're staring at people for too long, and we make them uncomfortable because we've been told, make eye contact, eye contact. Yeah.
For those who can't see, I am like very intensely staring at the camera.
Yeah. And for me as a kid, this showed up. My family would always joke about how obsessed with mirrors I was. They're like, oh God, Lindsey, don't put Lindsey in that chair. She'll just stare at herself the whole time. And what I didn't realize that I was doing is I was looking at other people in the mirror. I was talking to them in the mirror because that was way more comfortable and it felt way more natural than me staring directly into their eyes and their face.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
I didn't realize that I was doing it most of the time. This is just an innate thing that I did automatically, avoided eye contact and looked into a reflective surface when I talked.
I think that that's also one of the benefits of like online communication is that like this, I don't have to look at you in the eye. I'm looking at myself in this little screen here. And even when I do look at you, I'm not making eye contact, but it still feels natural to have this discussion. And that one is important to note that eye contact is not an important aspect of all cultures, but it is a very important aspect of Western culture in particular, people from like the UK, Europe, North America, all of those areas where eye contact is very heavily demanded. One of the things that is important to remember about all symptoms of the DSM-5 is that you have to take in context from people's cultural practices in order to find out what is different. I know in a lot of areas or in a lot of Eastern countries, eye contact is actually not thought of as something that is extremely respectful, the way it is here in the United States in particular. So again, just because this depiction of this symptom does not match you based off of your culture, it does not mean that there is not an existence of something similar based off of your cultural practices.
Absolutely. Okay. And then we have 3, deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or making friends, to an absence of interest in peers. And this one was really important when I was going through the diagnosis process, is realizing that as a child, what I considered playing with friends and playing with my peers was directed play, where I was like the little theater producer and I was telling everyone what to do. You're going to say this, and then you're going to say this, and you're going to stand here, and you're going to do this, and we're going to play it this way, this exact scenario, the way I have set up, or I'm not playing at all. And it's to the point where, I mean, my siblings and stuff, when we talk about family memories and growing up, you know, they'll be like, oh gosh, yeah, Lindsey was really bossy. Like she would freak out if you didn't do exactly what she said. So like we didn't really get a choice. And that is a big aha moment for a clinician to say, okay, that is not a normal peer-to-peer interaction. That is directed play, very autistic behavior.
I didn't have that experience to that extent. I did experience it at least a decent amount. However, one of the things that I definitely had a deficit in was developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. For my autistic brain, everyone who spoke to me was my friend. every single person. And it was very hard for me to differentiate between people who did not like me and were just speaking to me because they had to, and actual friends. And I've always had this difficulty because I had very little context of understanding what friendship actually means. Now, as I've grown up, and because I experienced that so much, now I've flipped in the opposite direction where I don't know who is my friend. And so I don't label people as my friends until they specifically state that we're friends. Like, I had a best friend in high school who I went to high school with. I did not know she was my best friend until everyone else told me that she was my best friend.
And overcorrection. I think that's the thing where I am so direct as an adult. I tell people, I like you and I want to be your friend because of that growing up, because of that confusion of not understanding relationship dynamics and knowing whether this is just a proximity-based relationship or is it a friendship. And so that's definitely an issue. Okay. Category B is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following, currently or by history. And remember, these examples are illustrative, not exhaustive. So number one is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, which is an example of motor stereotypes, lining up toys, flipping objects, echolalia, idiosyncratic phrases. Number two is insistence.
I have actually a really good example of that lining up the toys one, because a lot of people think it's just like lining up the Hot Wheels. I actually used to do what I called drive-in movie. Every single Saturday, I would wake up at exactly 9 a.m. and I would take all of my toys downstairs, line them up in perfect rows, and we would sit and we would watch cartoons. And I called it drive-in movie. I thought that that was just how I played. And it was. But at the same time, it was how my autism interacted my play.
Yeah, I would play store and things like that. But the entire purpose of it, and again, me, little bossy pants me, was to line up all of my collections, my belongings. And I had no interest in actually like pretending to buy or sell anything. The entire purpose, yes, the entire purpose of the game was to line up and arrange and organize all of my possessions.
Lindsey, that is so autistic. How did you not diagnose?
Well, that's because I was just considered bossy. Mm-hmm. You know, I was just a very dramatic, particular
that
kid.
Gender bias.
Mm-hmm. Right. As a little girl, I was just bossy and dramatic. Number two is insistence on sameness. Inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Examples: extreme distress at small changes, difficulty with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, needed to take the same route or eat the same food every day.
My mom literally talked about this with my boyfriend because he just happened to mention that I have a bagel for breakfast every single morning. And my mom was like, oh yeah, that's what's easy about Becky. For like 2 years straight, she had just cinnamon and brown sugar oatmeal for breakfast. 2 years straight, every morning. Didn't want pancakes, didn't want bacon and eggs. I just wanted my oatmeal every single morning. And it had to be made with the exact correct ratio of water. It could not be too watery. It could not be too dry. It had to be made very specifically, or else I couldn't handle it.
Yeah. I mean, I had things like that where I brought the exact same thing for lunch for K to 12, but I also would have meltdowns and would have these big emotional outbursts and really freak out if my mom moved anything in my room. So she would come in she's like, my kid is a pack rat, and would move something, would take, my laundry, take the dirty dishes out, whatever it was, try to tidy something up. And when I came home and I saw this, I would just lose control and melt down and have what to outsiders look like a huge temper fit over nothing, a temper tantrum. Mm-hmm. And I now know as an adult that change in my environment was so triggering to me. Would have a meltdown. I completely lost control of my faculties because something in my safe space, my room, had changed.
Yeah. My room was always messy, but I could not have anybody else clean it because I knew exactly where everything was. I could give people directions like, take 3 steps towards the little pink sweater and then go to the left. If you've hit the paperclip on the floor, you've gone too far. Like, I knew where everything was. Don't clean my room because I will freak out.
Yeah. Number 3 is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Example, strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects. So these are things that typically look unusual. They use the word like abnormal. Again, this is a clinical psychology book. We will often see the stereotype of the autistic train lover or, ceiling fans of fixation. But this can also manifest as any interest, any special interest.
Special interest.
Riki has a shark wall behind her that you can't see. For me and a lot of people who are late diagnosed, who don't realize they're autistic until they are adults, our special interest, our fixation comes out in something that we can read a lot about. And so if you are reading lots of books about something, adults around you are like, oh, that's great. This kid's just really studious. They are a little professor. That is a stereotype of autism. And so it may go unnoticed. So if you were a horse girl, like to the nth degree, okay, that might have been your autistic special interest. I have always been into murder mysteries in the Victorian era. Like I'm talking about but my grandmother, as a first grader, gave me Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes and all of these things to read, and I loved it. And so that manifested eventually into my love of all things Victorian and mystery related stuff as well. But again, I was seen as this studious, smart little kid. But like, is it normal for a first grader to be obsessed with Victorian murder? No, it's not. That's a very autistic little kid.
Mine was spiders, much to the chagrin of everyone in my life, especially because my dad really indulged it by capturing black widows for me to keep as a pet. Like they were in like a little terrarium and everything.
Black widows?
Yeah, black widows.
Those are toxic. Wow.
Yes and no. Actually, in the United States of America, there has not been a recorded death by black widow since the 90s. Black widow venom is not nearly as toxic as most other spiders, and they are extremely docile creatures. They really do not bite unless they feel ultimately threatened. They're more of a flight rather than fight kind of spider. They're not very aggressive at all.
Okay. Well,
which
there
is why
you
my
have
dad was
it.
able to capture them so easily.
Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input is number 4. So unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment can also be a part of this. Apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse responses to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascinations with light and movement. Anything sensory is a large component of most autism diagnoses.
And like this can exist in different, like you can be hyposensitive in one area and hypersensitive in others. Like I'm hypersensitive to pain, especially anything like having to do with like needles, or like my mom used to pop my acne on my back and I would scream because I could feel it like all over my body. However, like I'm very like averse to light touch. Like I'm hyposensitive with that, which is why I need heavy weighted blankets. I need weight on my chest I need deep pressure for basically everything.
And I have sensory issues as well, but mine are different from Riki's. So I have a pretty high threshold for pain. In fact, showing my tattoo sleeves, all my tattoos on here, they don't really hurt me. I find getting tattoos to be very relaxing. So there's some forms of pain where, again, I'm a bit hyposensitive to it. Like I don't feel it as strongly, versus I am hypersensitive to most smells, to the point where I will vomit. I can smell things that nobody else in the room smells. I'm similar with sounds, where I'll hear the electricity in the room. And I'm not just talking about like a hum coming from a generator. People with hypersensitivity, we hear things that brains typically tune out. Your brain will tune out your own body smells and constant background noises, because otherwise you would drive yourself crazy. For many autistic people, our brains don't tune out those experiences. And so I smell every layer, every little thing. And so I can smell garbage from miles away, and it nauseates me, it sickens me, it overpowers me, and overwhelms me. And it could be the same with sounds that nobody else in the room hears. And I'm like, I can't. There's a buzzing noise.
Please excuse my irrational anger. I'm being stabbed in the brain by a buzzing that won't shut up.
Exactly. And so, yeah, you can have hyposensitivity, where you need things to be stronger because they barely register, or hypersensitivity, where things are too strong.
I'm actually not as sensitive as other autistic people are to hearing small noises. For me, my hypersensitivity with noise actually comes from frequencies. I don't necessarily hear the hum of the electricity, but if there is something at a high or low frequency, I can feel it. And that's one of the reasons why, even though I love music, I will never go to a concert ever in my life, because there are certain sounds that I experience the frequencies of in my full body. If I hear the drums, I can feel that. If I hear a heavy bass, I can feel that. And I can't block that out through headphones, because that's not coming through my ears. It's coming everywhere.
Yeah. You feel sound waves in your whole body, and it's overwhelming.
And I'm very hypersensitive to that.
Yeah. Okay. Category C is symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, or may be masked by learned strategies later in life. And that is a really important thing to be aware of, is like we said, is that yes, you struggled with these things as a kid, but you may have come up with coping mechanisms, or it may be that you had such a structured environment that it's not until you're on your own, it's not until you go to college or you get your first job or you're in your first apartment, you have some independence, that things all fall apart.
Yeah. And I think that this is why a lot of people have difficulty wrapping their minds around the fact that they are in fact disabled just by having autism, particularly people who are lower support needs, usually around level 1 autism, because there are 3 different levels of autism according to the diagnostic criteria. This is how we measure the supports that are needed. Level 1 means that you require support. A lot of people think that low support needs means no support needs. That is not true. You do still require support. Level 2, you require substantial support. So a level 2 autistic person may be able to live on their own, but they might need somebody to come and check in on them a lot, because they can't live on their own on a consistent basis. They need significant support with remembering things, with, going to their jobs, things like that. And then level 3 autism requires very substantial support. These are very often, but not always, the people that we see with higher support needs who are completely non-speaking, who lack the ability to verbally communicate what they need and require assisted living. They may require AAC devices on a more permanent basis than other autistic people. And so with all of that said, I think because a lot of people with lower support needs tend to develop these coping mechanisms and have that support, whether they realize it or not, it's very difficult for them to understand without those supports, you are disabled. The support does not eliminate the disability. It eliminates the struggle from the disability.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the situation where I seemingly communicate very well. I've been taught this. I've learned these skills over time. I've taken communication courses and public speaking courses and trainings and theater and all of these things, right? Theater is a huge one to learn how to do this. But when it comes to care tasks, when it comes to things like, remembering to eat and washing my face, showering, brushing my teeth, all of those kinds of things, I struggle with. I struggle with that a lot. And I struggle with paperwork, with email communication, with bills, with anything related to that. And without support, if I didn't have family members or roommates or partners who took on those tasks and either did them for me or assisted me with those things on a frequent, regular basis, I would not be able to successfully be on my own. Like it's interesting because we get these comments all the time because we are public personas on social media, openly autistic women in particular, that people will say, "Oh, you don't look autistic."
I'm sorry, I left it in my other pants.
Right. I only look autistic on Sundays. What are you talking about?
Hold on,
yeah.
let me grab a train. Does that fix it for you?
Exactly. But when people say those things, it's because they see only one aspect of me online. They don't know all of the struggles and how much support I actually need in real life. And so that is something that was really difficult for me to unpack with my autism diagnosis, is that I truly have never been independent. I have never lived independently. I have always had supports. And I'm so lucky because I have a lot of autistic friends who did not have supportive families, did not have supportive communities, friend groups, or people around them. So they did go through homelessness. They've experienced some of the hardships that I was protected from. But I am in that same category where without that assistance, without that help from outsiders, I would very much be in the exact same boat as them.
So glad that you had that support. Like I think of sometimes where I would be if I did have more support, because like one of the biggest struggles that I have with my partner right now is realizing that I can rely on him because he is consistent. He's very consistent and very reliable with the things that I need. However, I struggle because I've been without the support that I need for so long that I have this hyper individualistic mindset where I'm like, no, you do everything on your own. You do everything on your own. You don't ask for help. You're not allowed to have accommodations, because I wasn't allowed to have accommodations in home. My mom very much treated my autism like that's a thing outside of the house. You don't get to be autistic in the house. You get to be autistic out at school, but here you're a normal kid. So I'm still unlearning a lot of that trauma, but it's a learning process, and I am getting better about asking for help.
That's a really good point. We also then have category D, where symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning.
This is such an important aspect of what we were just talking about, because again, so many people are like, autism is not a disability if it's level 1. It is. And this is something that we hear from the autism community, because many people in the autism community do not feel disabled by their autism. If it is not disabling, it is not autism. And that may be hard for some people to hear. That doesn't mean that the struggles you have are not valid. That does not mean that you are not valid. However, autism is more than just the vibes. It is a disability. In order to be autistic, according to the DSM-5 TR, you have to be disabled.
Yeah. And I think, again, people have a lot of what we call internalized ableism, where they have beliefs about disability, whether it's the word itself or just what they think disability should look like or feel like, and refuse to be in that category. And I think, it's admitting your own weakness, and that's hard. That is a difficult thing, especially like you said, if you've built up this tough exterior, you have take a lot of pride in your independence. If you have put in a whole bunch of coping mechanisms and supports and things like that. So you're like, no, I can't be disabled because I have a job and I have this or that. Again, without those supports, would you be able, to do those things? And I know for myself, no, the answer is no. I can't on my own with no supports, no help, no nothing. I can't do those things. And that is something I think a lot of people really need to do some introspection and acknowledge that no, I, at the end of the day, am not this strong, independent woman. I have a disability that does impair me in parts of my life. And I need support in parts of my life. And that is okay.
Honestly, the places where I need the most support are definitely those social deficits. I still significantly struggle with that. And that is one thing that I rely a lot on my partner with. I have this math equation in my head that I'm constantly doing when I'm going through socialization, where if I say something and it takes them longer than 3 seconds to respond, that means one of two things in my brain. That one, I've said something incorrect and missed a social cue, or two, they no longer want to talk to me. And so but that's the math equation that I've had. And so I've been trying not to do that. And I rely a lot on my partner to kind of be a buffer between me and my social awkwardness. And he's really very sweet about doing that. He's really good at helping me interact with our friends in a way that makes me feel more comfortable. And our friends are also very, very welcoming to me. They know that I'm autistic, so they know I'm occasionally going to say things weird. And they tend to just make me feel like part of the gang with it. But yeah, I definitely struggle a lot with that.
Yep. I think that's something that a lot of us don't realize that we do, that we depend on a partner, a friend, a family member to help us with these things. And we just have taken that for granted and not realized, wow, that is a support system that we rely on heavily. Yeah. And now we have category E. These disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability, intellectual developmental disorder, or global developmental delay. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur. To make comorbid diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability, social communication should be below that expected for the general developmental level. And this is one of those tricky conversations.
Very much so.
That we have in the autism community in particular, and to people outside looking into the autism community, is that because intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, are so highly comorbid, meaning people have both, so highly comorbid with autism, that there is a tendency for people to want to separate themselves amongst the autism community. And there used to be a diagnosis called Asperger's that no longer is a diagnosis, and that is also very problematic in its history. You can look up Asperger's bad on the internet and find a lot of things that have to do with the Nazis and something called superiority. And so we no longer use that term.
Part of the reason that we no longer use Asperger's syndrome is not just because of the abhorrent history and link of Hans Asperger in and of himself to the Nazi party. It also has to do with the fact that there is no clear line between Asperger's and autism. And one person could go to one doctor and that doctor will say, you clearly have Asperger's syndrome. And then that same person could go to a different doctor and that different doctor would be like, you clearly have autism spectrum disorder. And because, again, it's all about perception of the clinician rather than a clear defined line between the two. And it also had a tendency of just completely ignoring autistic people with who don't meet the criteria for level 3, but also needs more significant support than level 1. It left them in this amorphous place where they were both Asperger's and not Asperger's at the exact same time. So it's not just because it's an offensive term that we no longer use it. And I try and remind people of that. I mean, I personally really don't like the term because I am Jewish and I don't like the association with Nazis. However, my feelings about it were not the reason it was taken out. It was taken out because it's not accurate. And that's what I think needs to be discussed whenever we discuss the history of Asperger's and its legacy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the main thing that we need to remember is that as much as those of us with, I will say, high IQ, it, again, which is there's a lot of problems with a lot of the tests that are given. But I will say this, those of us without an intellectual disability and those of us who may have been labeled gifted as children, may have a harder time coming to terms with our own autism identity and diagnosis. That there is, I think, again, this is internalized ableism, but I think there is this part of people that may not want to be seen in a bad light. And the way that they perceive disability and the way that they perceive intellectual disability
it's like the moralizing of it.
Right. Is that in their minds, that's a bad thing and I don't want to be associated with it. And so, again, they'll want to use a different term for themselves. Or I say things like, I'm not like those autistics.
Yeah. And
you know, you get that kind of vibe off people.
Like where it's like, no, I'm better than you.
Exactly.
And also, like, so one of the things that was often associated with Asperger's syndrome is like the belief of having a high IQ along with your autism. And let me just explain to you why that is such bullshark. So I was originally diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Part of it was giving me an IQ test. And IQ tests are just so extremely biased to whoever made them. Like, they are not accurate. And I'm a living example of the fact that they are not accurate because my IQ is apparently somewhere around the lines of like 142. And yet until like 4 years ago, I didn't know where Mexico was. And to give you an example on
I'm so sorry, I just started laughing. That was not what I was expecting you to say.
To give an example of how ridiculous that is and how like that's a not IQ brain thing, like stereotypically high IQ thing. I live in Southern California. I live literally like an hour away from the border, and I that entire growing up, because we would drive to Texas all the time. I thought you had to go through Texas to Mexico. I didn't know it was right next to California. We once were Mexico, and I didn't realize. So if you ever think that, just remember, your friendly neighborhood autistic bimbo.
Yeah, but again, I think part of it is that we as a society have determined that having a high IQ is somehow morally good. And that is not the case. And that having, a lower IQ is somehow a bad thing. And that's the thing is like, they're neutral. This is just completely neutral. And also IQ tests are biased. And we could talk about that another time.
But that's a whole deep dive.
This is why it's important, though, as a community, that people with different support needs, people with different intellectual capacities, that we rally around one another as an autism community, as an autistic community, and we support each other, because at the end of the day, we have more in common with one another as autistic people than we do with the outside world.
Yeah, always tell autistic people, you are a lot closer to being an autistic person with higher support needs than you will ever be to being non-autistic. You will always be closer to that person that you are looking down on than a non-autistic person.
Exactly. And so I think that's why right now the DSM does not think that there needs to be a differentiation. And I personally don't want to push for that either, because again, like, as a community, we can do more to support one another and to advocate for each other than we could do if we were separated out linguistically.
And I know that there's a lot of parents of people who have significantly higher support needs who are very loud about wanting to bring back that term. Again, I just don't think they understand why it was eliminated, because it's all based off of perception and not actual data and experience from the autistic person. Because again, just like, when we were talking about how autism is a disability, even if you don't feel disabled by it, it's like a lot of the people who are being diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome were privileged enough to have support. So you wouldn't even know exactly how much their autism impacts them and how much it disables them without those supports. Like, again, I'm a privileged person. I am a white lady who grew up in Southern California with a family that could afford to at least support me a little bit. Sure, they weren't nice about it, but they did it. And who knows what I would have been like if I didn't have that support,
Yeah. And again, we just see so much more value as a full, robust community, as opposed to trying to separate people out by little minuscule things and categories. I personally am proud to be autistic and to support all of my fellow autistics.
And remember, when we advocate for those with higher support needs, a rising tide lifts all ships. When you advocate for the ones who are like the most severely impacted by what is going on, you will still benefit from that. Like, for example, AAC devices, they are primarily used by non-speaking autistic people who struggle significantly in their abilities to verbally communicate. But I use AAC communication when I am struggling with a verbal shutdown experience after I've had a meltdown. Like, I use that. I wouldn't have even known that that was an option unless I actually paid attention to autistic people with higher support needs. That accommodation that they receive helped me, even though I don't have the same support level as they do. I don't need that much support levels.
Can go the opposite way as well, where parents can learn a lot from autistic adults who are sharing their experiences, who may have lower obvious support needs, perhaps in comparison with their child, but at the same time is you can see oh, okay, what are things that were helpful to you in your experience and as you grew up and things like that. And so I just feel like, again, we are so much stronger, as a whole
when we are
community.
Unified. Which I'm really glad we did this discussion of the DSM-5 TR autism symptoms. Criteria, thank you. Diagnostic criteria. I took my ADHD medication today. It's working, as you can tell.
I'm at a point where I can no longer mask. I'm really feeling my energy go. So this is probably a good time for us to end the episode.
A good stopping space. Again, you can find these resources from the links down below. We will include the link to the CDC and the one from Dr. Neff. I was about to say Professor Neff. And I was like, that doesn't sound right. I'm the absent-minded professor today. But I really hope that this discussion has helped a lot of people better understand the diagnostic criteria and how it can differently impact people than what is listed on the page. Because again, one of the problems with autism, as we discussed, is rigid thinking patterns. So a lot of us assume that because we don't have it exactly like it's listed in the DSM, it means that it's not true and we don't meet the criteria. But as Lindsey and I have discussed, there are different ways that you can meet the criteria.
Absolutely. And as we always say, is that autism is a spectrum. So it looks different in everybody. If you have met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. Well, thank you for being with us. I am Lindsey, Brains and Spoons.
I am Rebecca Ribera Bonbon.
And you can find Asking Autistics all the places. And don't forget to subscribe, comment, push button somewhere.
Join our army. One of us. One of us.
All right.
On Thursdays, we have cookies.
I like that.